Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to this second webinar in our Religion and Numbers series. And a very warm welcome to anyone joining us for the first time, and welcome back for those of you who were with us for episode 1. It's a great pleasure to introduce this afternoon, Dr. Kiana Cox from the Pew Research Center in Washington. And by the way, for those who don't know, my name is Julian Hargreaves. I'm the Director of Research here at the Woolf Institute. As I say, it's a great pleasure and a privilege to welcome Dr. Kiana this afternoon, lunchtime as it is over there in Washington. We've long admired the work of the Pew Research Center, and personally I've used it many times as a resource for my own research and teaching. And it was a great privilege actually last year to have Kiana and her colleagues review some work of ours here at the Woolf Institute, and we were all really grateful for their time. And so it's an enormous pleasure to invite Kiana back this afternoon. For those interested, and for those who don't know, Dr. Kiana Cox is a research associate at the Pew Research Center. She's recently joined the race and ethnicity research team, has been with them for around a month, and previously contributed to the team, but also focused on religion and religious communities across America. Kiana earned her doctorate in sociology from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and prior to joining the center was assistant professor of sociology at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, where she taught courses on race, gender, social movements, statistics, and research methodology. This afternoon, Kiana will be presenting her work, which was recently published back in February, and a report entitled Race in the Religious Lives of Black Americans. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Kiana. Thank you, Kiana, and welcome.
Thank you, Julian. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so the audience can see my slides. There we go. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'd like to thank Julian and the Woolf Institute for inviting me to give this talk today, and for the ongoing conversations, as he mentioned, between his team and the Religion and Public Life team at Pew Research Center. I want to start just briefly to talk a little bit about Pew Research Center. And one of the things that is important to know about us is that we are a nonpartisan and non-advocacy fact tank that is a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trust. That means that we don't take policy positions or make policy recommendations. However, we use data-driven social science research to inform the public about the issues and trends and attitudes that are shaping our world. Pew Research Center is organized into several teams, which include the study of religion, politics, race and ethnicity, science and technology, news and journalism, and also several teams which look at all of these issues internationally. For this particular study, which we've entitled, and I've put the link to the full report in the chat for those who are interested, but this full study is entitled Faith Among Black Americans. And particularly today, I'm going to look at the intersection of race and religion for Black Americans. At Pew, we believe that religion is one of the factors that actually impacts people's views about the social world. And in fact, we have a long history of doing in-depth research on various religious groups and regions around the world. So just last month, the Religion and Public Life team at Pew published a 2020 study of Jewish Americans. We've also conducted studies on Muslims, Mormons, evangelicals in Latin America, Christians in Western Europe, and our international team is currently wrapping up a large-scale study on religion in India. So what we realized, however, is that in the midst of all of this in-depth work that we were doing, is that we had not done a similar deep dive on Black Americans. And that's mostly because our surveys at the center typically have large representative samples of Black Americans in them. However, we had not yet asked questions that looked at Black people and how they understand religion and how they practice it as African Americans in the United States. We felt that was a gap in our research agenda that needed to be filled. So therefore, in order to accomplish this deep dive into religion among Black Americans as they understand it and practice it, we use various recruitment methods in order to build a sample that was large enough to get at this depth and to provide us some nuance in our analysis. So it included 3 standing probability panels, which is our panel at Pew Research Center, known as the American Trends Panel, the NORC AmeriSpeaks panel, and the Ipsos Knowledge Panel. We supplemented those panels with an address-based sample via the firm Westat. And so our final sample consisted of 8,660 Black Americans. We also conducted 7 in-person focus groups, both to inform the construction of the survey and to serve as a standalone qualitative data source. And the results of this focus group are reported in Chapter 1 of the report. I should also note that both the data for the survey and the focus groups were collected prior to the COVID-19 were collected prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. So these data were collected late 2019 and into early 2020 before most of the world shut down due to the pandemic. Now I'd like to turn to some of our findings about religion among Black Americans. And I want to start with belief. So what we found in our survey data in these findings is that the beliefs about God are widespread among Black Americans. In fact, nearly all Black Americans believe in God or some other kind of higher power. Among those who believe, about 75% of them believe in God as described in religious texts. So this means that they believe in God as described in the Bible, the Quran, or some other holy book. About 20% say they don't believe in God as described in any of these holy books, but they do believe in some other kind of spiritual power or force in the universe. In comparison, only about 2% of Black Americans say that they don't believe in any higher power at all. So belief in God, regardless of the kind of God or spiritual power, is really widespread among Black Americans. We also asked Black Americans to share with us how they identify religiously. We found that about 75% of Black Americans are Christian, say that they are Christian. Specifically, 66% are Protestant, 6% report that they are Catholic. About 3% fall into a category that we are calling in this study other Christians. This category is comprised mostly of Jehovah's Witnesses, but also include Orthodox Christians, Mormons, and other Christian groups. So about 3% fall into that other Christians category. Another 3% fall into a category that we have labeled other faiths. And the majority of this group are Black Muslims, but also include African Americans who are Buddhists, those who practice African traditional or African or Afro-Caribbean religions, as well as those who say that they are spiritual but not religious. So that's about 3% of people who fall into that other faiths category. Lastly, we found that about 21% of Black Americans are not affiliated with any religion at all. We refer to them as religious nones, N-O-N-E-S. For short. So this group includes atheists and agnostics, but it's mostly comprised of people who say that their religion is nothing in particular when they were asked to specify their religion. So that's the breakdown of religious affiliation among Black Americans in the United States. They are primarily Protestant, but a sizable minority are also in this religiously unaffiliated or this nones category. I think it's also important to note that Black Americans are more likely than the general public in the United States to be Protestant, but also less likely than the general public to be Catholic. Continuing on with just a little bit about basic or foundational religious beliefs and practices. we found that prayer plays multiple roles in the lives of Black Americans. So about 80% of Black Americans say that they pray once a month, if not more. Almost the same share say that they believe that prayer has the power to heal illness, sickness, disease, or injury. But also, over half of Black Americans say that they rely on prayer in order to make major decisions about their personal life. So, about 56% of Black Americans say that. In fact, they rely on personal prayer more than they rely on advice from religious or professionals or other professionals such as therapists, etc. So personal prayer actually ends up being a very important factor in how Black Americans make decisions about their lives. Also, about a third of Black Americans say that they believe in the power of prayer to their ancestors, meaning that they believe that if they pray to their ancestors will protect them. About a third of Black Americans believe this. Also, it's interesting to note that there is no difference between Black Americans who are religiously affiliated or unaffiliated in this belief. Both groups, about a third of both groups, believe that prayers to ancestors can protect them. And now I want to dive into not long, but a pretty detailed discussion about religious service attendance. But there's a couple of things that I want to define first before we get into where Black Americans actually attend religious services or go to church. So since the majority of Black Americans are Christians, remember we said about 75% of them are Christians, we needed to be able to distinguish between the types of churches that they go to. One approach for doing this would require us to analyze denomination, and this is a pretty common approach. From that perspective, we see that at least 20% of Black Americans are affiliated with a historically Black Protestant denomination. Now, these historically Black Protestant denominations are ones that were founded during slavery or Jim Crow, which is the colloquial term for the era following slavery, between slavery and the Civil Rights Movement. So these denominations were founded during the late 19th and early 20th century. And they primarily got their start, most of them, as a response to racial segregation in mainline denominations. So about 20%, at least 20% of Black Americans are affiliated with these historically Black churches. Another 20%, at least 30% belong to evangelical or mainline Protestant denominations, and still another 30% just presented us with maybe vague or ambiguous affiliations. So they would say, I'm just Baptist, or I'm just Protestant, or I'm just Christian. So this is what we come up with when we use a denominational approach. But one of the limits of a denominational analysis is that first, lots of Americans, regardless of race, often don't know what denomination their churches belong to. Some Americans belong to multiple denominations throughout their lives, both childhood and adulthood, and still other Americans might attend churches that don't have a denomination at all. And so, given those limits of the denominational analysis, and to be clear, we still measured denomination, but we did not use denomination as the primary unit of analysis for analyzing where Black Americans attend religious services in this study. Instead, we decided to use racial classifications. Specifically, we asked respondents to share with us the race of the congregations that they attended, as well as the race of the religious leaders. And we came up with 3 categories in order to classify Protestant churches. So first, Black churches are those where the respondents reported that all or most of the congregation was Black and most of the senior clergy were Black. So in Christian churches, we're talking about the senior pastor, or the priest of a congregation. Excuse me. White or other race churches are those where the respondents said that the majority of the congregation was white, Hispanic, Asian, or some other race or ethnicity. Although the majority of people in this study who said that they attended these kinds of churches, the majority of the churches that they attended were white. So white churches primarily make up this category. And finally, the last racial classification that we use for Protestant churches were multiracial churches. In this instance, the respondents reported that no single race makes up the majority of the attendees or the clergy. So again, instead of using a denominational approach to distinguish between churches, we use this racial classification based on the race of the congregation and the race of the senior religious leaders. And so now just some basic facts about attendance. We found that about 60% of Black Americans attend religious services at least once a year, if not more. This includes a third who go weekly, about 10% who go monthly, and 18% who go once or twice a year. This is in contrast to the nearly 40% who say that they seldom or never attend religious services. Now that we know where or how we're classifying churches in terms of whether or not congregations are Black, white, or other race congregations or multiracial, now we can get a better sense of the kinds of churches that Black Americans, particularly Black Protestants, go to. So among Black Protestants who attend religious services at least yearly, 2/3 of them are going to Black churches. So 2/3 of Black Protestants go to specifically Black churches, so places where the majority of the congregation and the senior religious leaders are Black. Among Catholics, only 17% attend a majority Black congregation. And among Black Americans who practice other faiths, about 30% of them attend Black congregations. So what this is telling us is that for Black Protestants, they are mostly worshiping with other Black people. Catholics and Black Americans who are members of other faiths are mostly worshiping in non-Black congregations. So on this slide, I want to draw your attention to these red bars on the left-hand side. And so we found that affiliation is not the only factor associated with where Black Americans worship. Country of birth also plays a role. We found that Black Americans who were born in the United States were more likely to attend Black churches than those who were born in Africa or the Caribbean. So about 1/3 of Black Americans born in the United States attend Black churches. 18% of Black people born in Africa attend Black churches, and 25% of those born in the Caribbean attend Black churches. So being born in the United States is associated with being with attending a Black church. I should also note here on this slide, just to draw your attention to the right side, that Black Americans born in Africa and the Caribbean are more likely to be Catholic in terms of their affiliation than those born in the United States. So these are two factors that impact the kinds of churches that impact where Black Americans go to church, both their religious affiliation, but also where they were born. The last factor I'd like to discuss in terms of attendance is age. One of the things that we found in our study is that younger Black Americans are less likely than older Black Americans to attend a Black church. So they are less likely to be in congregations where the majority of the participants are Black and where the senior clergy are Black. So only about 30% of Gen Z, those are people who are under 24 years of age, and about 30% of millennials, people who are just about 40 years old right now. Only about 30% of those Black Americans actually attend Black churches, compared to nearly half of baby boomers or the silent generation. One of the reasons that we think this is happening, if I can draw your attention to the left side, is that younger Black Americans don't really attend very much. So about half of Black Americans who are in Generation Z and millennials say that they seldom or never attend religious services. So we think that the fact that they aren't attending is one aspect as to why they are less likely to attend the Black church. So our findings demonstrate that religious affiliation, country of birth, and age are all factors associated with the kinds of congregations that Black Americans worship in. And now that we've discussed some of these basic elements of religiosity, I'd like to turn our attention to a focus on Black identity, Black culture, and anti-racism in the religious lives of Black Americans. And so I'm going to draw your attention to these three blue bars. The first is calling out amen, dancing or jumping, and then speaking in tongues. Those are the three elements in this chart that I want to draw your attention to. Aside from racial composition, we found that Black Protestant churches also offer different kinds of worship in terms of the style of worship at their churches. So Black Americans who attend Black churches are more likely to be in congregations that engage in call and response. So call and response is a practice where the congregation speaks back to the religious leader or the person delivering the sermon during the sermon. So often this response will be an amen or other types of expression of approval or encouragement as the sermon is going on. So people aren't sitting quietly during the sermon in Black churches. They are also more likely to attend congregations. So these are Black Americans who attend Black Protestant churches. So in those churches, they are also more likely to be in congregations where people dance or jump spontaneously during portions of the service, but also the Black Americans who go to Black churches, as well as multiracial churches, are also more likely than those who attend other types of churches to say that people speak in tongues during their service. So these types of expressions where people are calling out amen during the service, where people are dancing during the service, where people are speaking in tongues, are most likely to happen in predominantly Black churches, as opposed to white churches, Catholic churches, or other types of Christian churches. Aside from the style of service, another thing that makes Black Protestant churches distinctive from other kinds of churches are the kinds of sermons that Black Americans are likely to hear there. So we found that nearly half of Black Americans who attend Black Protestant churches say that they have heard a sermon on race, racial inequality, or race relations in the year prior to the survey. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, and I think it's important to note here, that most of this data was collected prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, but most of the data, the vast majority of it, was also collected prior to the murder of George Floyd. So when we say in the year prior to the survey, respondents are thinking about 2019. So about half of Black Americans who attended Black churches prior to the protests of last summer said that they had heard sermons about race in their churches. About a similar share also said they had heard sermons about voting or political engagement in their churches. Again, this is going back to 2019. So Black Americans who attend Black churches are more likely to hear these kinds of sermons than those who attend white churches, multiracial, or Catholic churches. So we have seen in our data that Black churches are racially different from other kinds of churches in different ways. First, through the actual racial composition of the congregation with majority Black congregants and majority Black clergy. We've seen that the style of worship is different, which tends to be more vocal and expressive actually during the service. And we've also seen here that sermon content is another area where Black churches differ from other types of churches. So in sermons at Black churches, you're more likely to hear things about race and politics and also criminal justice reform. aside from offering these distinctive worship experiences that we just discussed, Black churches also play an important role in civic life. So we asked Black Americans about the impact that Black churches have had on moving Black people toward equality in the United States. And nearly 80% of them said that these organizations have helped that cause, either some or a great deal. And it's important to put that in context. So as we see here, Black Americans they rate predominantly Black churches a little lower than they rate civil rights organizations in terms of being helpful in helping Black people reach equality. But they also rate Black churches higher than the federal government. So Black churches sit in between those two entities, not rated quite as high as civil rights organizations, but rated higher than the federal government. It's also important to note that Black Americans also say that predominantly Muslim organizations, such as the Nation of Islam, also did a great deal or helped some in moving Black people towards equality. So about half of Black Americans say that about Black Muslim organizations. So when we talk about the extent to which Black religious organizations have been involved in Black civic life, this data demonstrates that Black Americans think that they have contributed quite significantly to that. Both Black churches and Black Muslim organizations, Black Christian organizations and Black Muslim organizations have contributed to that cause. We also asked Black Americans, so in some ways you can kind of view the previous question as we didn't ask about history, but a lot of times when people think about advancing equality, they think back to the civil rights movement. So in some ways that question kind of taps into history. What have these organizations done for Black Americans in the United States in sort of a broad view? In this question, we ask people to focus specifically on today and the extent to which they believe that Black churches have influence in Black communities right now. And we see from our findings that about 45% say that Black churches have about the right amount of influence, that they neither need to increase what they're doing or decrease what they're doing. But still, a similar share, about 41%, say that there's too little influence. So what this data tells us is that on the one hand, we see that Black Americans believe that Black churches have done quite a bit in terms of advancing the cause of equality for Black Americans, but still a sizable portion of them, 41%, believe that Black churches can do more in Black communities. One of the other questions that we also asked Black Americans in terms of assessing Black churches, we wanted to know whether or not how did they view the racial composition of the churches that they attended? And so we asked Black Americans whether or not they thought Black churches should become more racially or ethnically diverse, or should they maintain their traditional racial character? And we found that about 60% of Black Americans, regardless of the racial composition of their congregations, said that Black churches should become more racially and ethnically diverse. This is compared to about a third of Black Americans who said that they believe Black churches should remain predominantly Black. So a majority of Black Americans believe that Black churches should have more diversity in their congregations, that they should not remain predominantly Black. Furthermore, if Black Americans were looking for new congregations, so we asked them, if you were looking for a new church, what would be important to you as you were looking? And only a small percentage of Black Americans actually said that that the race of the congregation and the race of the clergy would be a very important factor in the congregations they were looking for. Instead, what they were more likely to say, so about 80% of Black Americans said that they would prioritize churches that were welcoming, whether or not the church had a welcoming atmosphere, and that they would also prioritize how inspirational the sermons were. So what our data demonstrates is that if Black Americans are looking for new churches, they are much more tuned in to how welcome they feel and how empowered the sermons are. They care more about that than they care about the race of the congregation or the race of the clergy. So how do we make sense of that, right? I just presented information that said that Black churches are distinctive in all of these ways, but then when you ask Black Americans specifically, do you think Black churches should remain Black? They essentially said no. The majority said they should diversify. So how do we make sense of this? Recall that at the beginning I said one aspect of our data collection was 7 focus groups that we conducted, both to inform the survey and to act as a qualitative data source for us. And I think those focus groups give us a sort of a window into how those two things of sort of the distinctiveness of a Black space, but also this call to diversify. I think this participant can give us a little bit of a glimpse into how those two things can exist in the same space. And so this focus group participant, who is affiliated with the historically Black denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, said this. They said, I'm not going to say that we're a Black church. It's predominantly Black. But when you said that to me, that's kind of like you were saying you go to a Black church. In God's eye, he doesn't care what color you are as long as you go. And so here, this participant is acknowledging that their church is Black based on composition, but is suggesting that designating the church specifically a Black church is exclusionary. That was the point that in this particular focus group that the participants were making. They didn't want to feel as if they felt that calling their church a Black church meant it was exclusively Black, that it was Black to the exclusion of others. And that is what they were rejecting. And so our findings suggest that this focus group data suggests to us that the idea that Black churches should diversify, that Black Americans hold, is not a rejection of the Blackness of the church, but a rejection of this exclusionary piece. They don't want churches to be viewed as only Black, or this is a Black church and people of other races cannot come in. That was the sentiment, that was the expression that that the focus group participants were making in this group. So that's how these participants are giving us a glimpse into how those things, the distinctiveness of a Black congregation, and then this idea that congregations should diversify. I think this participant is giving us a view into how those two things can exist in the same place. They don't want churches to be exclusionary. And now I'd like to end with just a couple of points about the importance of race, both to Black Americans' personal and religious identity. So first, we see that regardless of a religious affiliation, the majority of Black Americans say that being Black is at least somewhat, or in this case, very important to how they think about themselves. At least 70% of these religious groups, in terms of how they break out among Black Americans, believe this, with very few differences in between them. So Black identity, regardless of religious affiliation, is very important to Black Americans. I'm going to draw your attention in this slide to the second dot plot here. And so we know that Black identity is personally important to Black Americans, but our data also demonstrates that anti-racism is important to Black Americans' sense of religiosity. And so we found that about 75% of Black Americans, regardless of their religious affiliation, say that taking a stand against racism is an essential part of their faith or morality. So taking a stand against racism is an essential part of what being Christian means to them, of what being Muslim means to them, or if people were religiously affiliated, of what being a moral person means to them. So about 75% of Black Americans say that opposing racism is essential to their faith. A similar share say this about sexism as well. Notice that for Black Americans, the only thing on this scale that outpaces anti-racism and opposing sexism is belief in God. So believing in God, opposing racism, and opposing sexism are more essential to their faith than attending religious services, than avoiding premarital sex, and it's more essential than opposing abortion. And so we've seen through these last couple of pieces of data, these last two slides, that Blackness is an important part of Black Americans' personal identity, but also opposing racism is a significant part of their religious identity or their moral center as well. So I will stop right there. And I will be happy to take Julian's questions, to take your questions. And if you'd like to check out our whole report on faith among Black Americans, please visit us at pewresearch.org/blackfaith.
Kiana, that was absolutely brilliant. What a wealth of information there. And, the research that Pew does is, among the most trusted, isn't it, when it comes to issues of US society. And I think that your report kind of moves it on further, even further, and the very sort of the very robust, very sort of complete package of survey questions and data, I think, is such a rich resource, for researchers, for students, and also, as ever with Pew Research Center research, it's also very accessible. Feels like this is something where non-experts can turn. So I really congratulate you on a fantastic report, and I would urge everyone watching to check out the report and maybe begin with the summary online and then download the full report at a later date. So I've got a ton of questions for you, Kiana. So what I'd like to do is completely abuse my position as chair by asking you just two or three of the questions I've written down. Maybe whilst we're in discussion for the next few minutes or so, if any people viewing would like to add questions, and please do add them into the Q&A. I can see you've been a little more shy than a Woolf audience tends to be. So do please add some questions. Don't let me dominate the next 10 or 20 minutes. But I wanted to, like I said, a lot of questions. I wrote some down here. Yeah, I wanted to begin sort of back in the opening section of your presentation.
Okay.
And you talked about this around a third of respondents who reported a more vague notion of their denominations, who maybe answered just Christian or just Protestant. In my own research here, when I receive a response like just Jewish or just Muslim, I often presume, maybe rightly or wrongly, that respondents might be considered as sort of culturally Muslim or culturally Jewish, without maybe being a person who observes more strictly their faith. And I wondered if you and the team made any similar assumptions about religiosity from the people who answered just Christian or just Protestant. How do you treat those vague responses?
Well, we on the Religion and Public Life team, we have a very long process to make sure that we classify people correctly. So if people say that they are just Christian, just Baptist, just Pentecostal, we have codes for that. Generally, if we can, we try to fit them under various types of families or denominations. So if they say that they're just Baptist, we'll still put them in sort of the Baptist bucket. We just won't be able to further assign them to a specific Baptist denomination. So they don't go into some kind of amorphous bucket. They're still in the Baptist bucket. For people who are just Christian, that's a little harder. So we kind of keep them in the broad Christian bucket. But from there, we're not really, unless we have more information from other closed-ended questions, we're not really able to assign them to Protestant, Catholic, so on and so forth. So absolutely, we have a very detailed coding scheme that we use to make sure that people have somewhere to fit. We don't force them into categories. So we definitely have some don't know, unsure, other, we have some other categories to help with that exhaustiveness requirement for closed-ended questions. But we still do classify those people. I do want to say though, we didn't do this for Christians, but because we felt this was an important aspect to get at in terms of religion among Black Americans. We did have a question on the survey that asked Black Americans if they considered themselves Muslim aside from religion. So it's sort of getting at your idea. And that's because of, as I mentioned, in some of the data, we saw that Black Americans view the Nation of Islam as an important factor in Black civic life in terms of moving towards racial equality. Well, that sentiment is one that's been among Black Americans in terms of religion for a very long time. The idea that Islam or African derived religions are a way to have a more authentic Black identity or a deeper connection to Africa. And so we did ask Black Americans sort of what you're getting at, aside from religion, do you feel that you are Muslim? And about 3% of Black Americans said that they felt that they were Muslim aside from religion because they were raised that way, or they felt a kinship to that religion. So we got at something similar to what you're asking.
And just, thank you for that. And just to follow on from that, without wishing to labour it too much, do you look into religiosity among the respondents who answer just ... And do you see any differences?
We have not done that kind of analysis where we look at the people. I think it would be interesting, though, to see if those particular people differ in terms of prayer, attendance, religious salience. So how important is religion in your life? I think that would be interesting to do, but we don't have that kind of analysis in this report.
Okay. I spotted something and I wondered, it was only a small difference, just by a couple of percent. Mm-hmm. It looked like Generation Z was slightly more religious than millennials, but it's only slightly, 2%. And I wondered whether that was a real difference, or for the sort of technically afflicted amongst us, a statistically significant difference, or whether it was just a quirk of the sampling. Did you have any feel that maybe Generation Z was becoming more religious, and would you expect that increase to continue?
You mean in terms of the slide I had up about attendance?
Yeah, okay. Exactly.
No, we don't view that as statistically significant.
Okay.
We view them as being statistically similar. Okay. Right there, the 29. We don't have any evidence that Generation Z is necessarily more or less religious than millennials. So we're not in this question.
We're not seeing a sort of creep up of religiosity necessarily.
Not that we've seen in this study. Those two generations tend to be very similar. These are, like you said, sort of a quirk of the data, the fact that they're off by a couple of points.
Okay. I thought I might have hit on a new line of inquiry there, Okay, I'm going to open up the floor and just read out some of the questions. So, okay, we've got 3 questions. I'll go through them one by one for the next few minutes. So the first question: in some churches in the UK, although the congregation is Black, the minister and officiants are white. And the attendee asks, does that happen in the US at all?
Yes. So for our particular study, those types of congregations would fall in our multiracial congregation, a multiracial church designation, where there's sort of a mismatch between the congregation and the religious leaders. So that's how we measured that particular. I'm trying to see if I have any slides. No, we just have the definitions.
So just to be clear then, a predominantly white clergy with a predominantly Black congregation would be classified as a mixed
multiracial church.
Multiracial church, yeah.
Yes, I was scrolling through my sites to see the numbers on that. So for Protestants, that's about 22% of Protestants attend that kind of congregation, 40% of Black Catholics, and half of Black Americans of other faiths attend what we would call a multiracial congregation, where no single majority makes up the attendees, or where there's a mismatch between the attendees and the leadership.
That's really interesting. Okay, thank you for that. And so another question, I'm not sure if you maybe answered this. I'm going to read it out anyway, just in case I've misunderstood it, but I think you may have covered this. But anyway, I'll read it anyway. Did any respondents classify themselves as Christian or Muslim and no belief in God?
As Christian or Muslim and no belief in God. I don't know off the top of my head, but having coded just about all of the 8,000 people in this survey based on their religion, I'm sure those people exist. One thing I will say, though, about how we classify denominations is that our denominational questions and our belief in God questions are not dependent on one another. So it's entirely possible that if you say that you don't believe in God, that's a different response than answering I am atheist on the religion, on the what is your religion question. So just an FYI in terms of how we classify that, asking whether or not somebody believes in God is a separate survey question than asking what is your religion, response I am atheist. So it's possible to have somebody say I don't believe in God on the belief in God question, but then if you give them the religion question, they say I'm a Christian, or they answer that I feel like I'm a Muslim aside from religion question. So it's possible for those to coexist, but I wouldn't say those are common at all.
That's really fascinating because often, I don't want to get too technical for anyone watching, but often in this sort of layout of questionnaires, do you believe in God or do you have a religion is often a gateway question, isn't it, into a question about which religion. But you're saying that you keep those two very separate, so they're not tied together in the sort of logic of the survey.
Yes, they're right. There are sort of two. So like our belief in God question helps us to figure out, like that very first slide that I showed. So we ask, do you believe in God? And from that question, we try to parse out what kind of God or spiritual force do people believe in. That's sort of one family of questions, which is a different set of questions than what is your religion. So I don't even know that they're necessarily close together on the survey. They might be, I can't remember, but those questions don't necessarily intermix in how they're asked or how they're filtered.
And is that something that Pew Research Center have done for a long time? Have you always kept those separate, so you don't use one or the other as a gateway into the other?
Right. No. If people want to, so like I mentioned, do you believe in God? Yes or no. Versus what is your religion? Yeah. I am atheist. I am agnostic. Those are separate, and they've been that way in terms of how we measure religion.
Great, thank you. So we'll move down the questions then. I'll read out what was written. I was pleased to see the strength of support for anti-sexism, but wondered, brackets cynically, if this might reflect the polling process in which people might feel the need to virtue signal. So I guess a sort of social acceptability question here. Can you comment on your methods for achieving honest responses on this and other questions where respondents might feel the need to live up to a societal standard? So how do you deal with social acceptability bias?
That's a great question. I will preface this by saying research conducted by scholars outside of Pew, or scholars who do research on discrimination, particularly racial discrimination, and particularly racial discrimination among Black Americans. There is evidence from those scholars which demonstrates that when Black Americans are opposed to racial discrimination, they are also highly likely to be opposed to other kinds of discrimination or other kinds of inequality. So I totally understand the question in terms of virtue signaling and social acceptability bias, but there is very strong evidence from scholars who do work on discrimination that for Black Americans, if you are anti-racist, you are also more likely to be anti-sexist or to be against sexual or gender discrimination. In terms of how we deal with reactivity, one of the things that we did with these particular questions is that we asked them in a battery. And so we asked them, so this isn't a standalone question. It was asked specifically in terms of which of the following items do you think are essential to your faith? And people were able to respond to each individual item. So that question wasn't a standalone one. It was asked in a particular context. And so we didn't do that to particularly combat against reactivity per se, but I do think the fact that they were thinking about a particular context and what their faith means to them, perhaps it could help with that. So there was a context that was asked in, but I do think that this is not a quirk of the data. I do think that what we found here would support what other scholars have found in terms of Black people being against multiple forms of discrimination, in addition to being anti-racist.
Okay, thank you. Is a question asked, quite, I suppose, controversial to an extent. Is there an analogous racial divide in US university departments of theology and religious studies?
Say that again.
I suppose is there an analogous racial divide in US university departments of theology and religious studies? I suppose they're asking.
Analogous.
Yeah, I suppose they're asking whether.
Analogous to what?
Yeah, analogous. Yeah, sorry, forgive me. Analogous. Wondering whether there's a racial divide in theology and religious studies in US universities.
That I actually can't speak to. I'm a sociologist by training, so I'm not exactly sure about theology departments or seminary in terms of training for religious education. I'm not sure about that.
Okay, well, straightforward answer. A longish question before I return to a couple of my own then. On the last slide, excuse me, I'll start again. On the last slide, I was curious whether terms like sexism and racism were defined for the respondents. As an example, to clarify, many churches prohibit women from preaching, which some regard as a form of sexism. If such practice were bound up with the concept of sexism, it might be surprising for a majority of individuals to indicate opposition to that practice while potentially attending churches with male-only leadership. And he finishes, I therefore wondered when respondents indicated opposition to racism and sexism as being particularly important to their faith life, whether those terms were defined for the respondents or whether they were left to fill in those meanings for themselves.
Right. Yeah, no, we did not define racism or sexism. We used alternate language. So racism. So the question was opposing racism or racial inequality, opposing sexism or gender discrimination. So sometimes we'll use a couple of clarifying words, but we don't define the term for them. I will say there are, I'm scrolling through our report just to make sure I can quote the correct number. One part of the question sounded like it was talking about whether or not women should be leaders. And so we can't know whether or not that was in people's minds as they were answering the opposing sexism as essential to my faith question. But we did ask a question, and this is in, I think, chapter 7 of the report. We have a whole chapter on gender in the report, where we found that about 85% of Black Americans said that women should be able to lead congregations. So this may or may not be what the person was asking, but there does seem to be some bit of congruence there that if people felt that opposing sexism was essential to their faith, at least 80% of Black Americans, regardless of the demographic group that they're in, believes that women should be able to lead congregations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. So,
I guess that kind of answers the other question too, sort of as a check on the sexism question.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on to the last question from the question answer box then. Is there any research on family members, couples or spouses that have different faiths? So interreligious marriage, was that involved in your survey, or have you done any other work on that, or know of any other work?
We have not written a report on that particular question for this sample yet, but we do have the data. We haven't analyzed it just yet, but we definitely do have data on spouses' religion. We have questions on religious switching. So that's something that'll be to come from us. So we have the data, but I can't report on it because we haven't run the analysis on it just yet.
I want to ask you a sort of slightly mischievous question to round
Okay.
to round off our section. I was really interested in the focus group comments about the notion of a black church and what it
Yes.
might mean in terms of exclusionary practice, and I wondered if that gave you an opportunity to self-reflect on your own terminology in the study. Did it make you sort of question your own categories? Was there any discussion about moving away from the phrase black church in your own report?
Absolutely. It's it's funny that you asked that because that for me was the single biggest sort of revelation of the focus groups. And we knew we needed to ask this of the focus groups, but I personally was surprised at how much respondents rejected that term. Much in the way that the focus group participant that I quoted, lots of people in the focus groups rejected the term in the same way. They felt that it was exclusionary, or when they thought about the Black church, they thought of the historical role. So they thought of Martin Luther King. They thought of churches like I mentioned being started during slavery as these kinds of institutions that was a buffer against segregation in society. So when they thought of the Black church, they thought of it in the historical role. They did not think that their churches were these Black churches in the sense of being only Black or forever Black. So yes, that definitely impacted how we wrote questions from the survey. So we stayed away from the phrase the Black church. So when we asked the question about the role of churches and communities, we asked about the role of churches and religious organizations. We tried to be broad. We did not use sort of the capital T, capital B, capital C, the Black church. We wanted to stay away from that. And the focus groups helped us know that that was a good choice because that term was very contested in the groups.
It made me think, actually, not knowing anything about the focus group data or having seen it or spent time with the participants, obviously, but it made me think it was quite powerful in terms of a counter narrative to some of the stereotypes around self-segregation or self-exclusionary practices. It felt like way more inclusive than some of the sort of stereotypes we're told about.
Absolutely. I mean, and that was a very repetitive and firm sentiment in the groups that God doesn't care what color you are. I don't care what church I go to as long as the teaching is sound, as long as the sermons are inspiring. So we saw that in the data. Black people wanted a welcoming atmosphere, inspiring sermons. We saw that in the focus groups too. People they prioritized having a rich and deep spiritual experience, no matter who was singing and no matter who was preaching and no matter who was in the pews. That was a very strong sentiment in our groups.
Well, I think on that largely positive note, we should perhaps end there for this webinar. Kiana, it's been a huge pleasure, enormous privilege to have you present, online, but here at the Woolf Institute. And it was great to welcome you again. And we hope you'll be involved with our work soon. And it's always great hearing you speak. And I would urge people to read the report. It's fantastic. A typical example of the really solid work that the Pew Research Center continues to produce as really one of the world's leading exponents of this kind of study. So a huge thank you, Kiana. For those interested, we continue the series on the 1st of July with Dr. Daniel Stetsky, who is a senior researcher at the Institute of Jewish Policy Research. And he's a demographer and will be speaking about the responses to COVID, to coronavirus in British Jewish communities. His institute has really been leading the way in studying religious minorities and their responses to COVID. So that should be another great webinar. But it just leaves me to thank everyone for attending, and just to offer a further and final thank you to Kiana Cox, tonight's presenter. Thank you.